What's up, guys? You're looking at my 2022 KTM 350 XCF. If you've been following the channel, you'll be very familiar with this bike. This was my trusty Steed all of last season, and I actually have 100.0 hours on the meter. Could not finish the year better than that. I long debated whether or not I was going to sell this and get a new bike for 2024, but I have decided to ride this thing for another year. I'm just not quite ready to part with this bike, and I would really like to podium an A-class cross-country race on this thing. I only made it to one race last year due to a busy schedule with weddings and other things that I let take priority. That said, I am excited to race in 2024, but this thing needs a tune-up. If you're a rider who rides hard and frequently throughout the course of a year, everything I do in this video is something that you should be doing to your own motorcycle. Let's get after it. With it being winter in Montana, I had to be very specific in my order of operations as I am unable to use my power washer when it is this cold outside. I need to do a suspension rebuild and check the valves on this bike, but I knew the top of the engine was way too dirty to pull the valve cover off. It needed a good, thorough wash, so before immobilizing it by removing the suspension, I removed the seat and tank, covered the fuel line, and brought the bike to the car wash. Once I arrived, I was about to unload the bike when I realized that for this task, I could absolutely just leave it in my truck bed. Work smarter, not harder. I rinsed my truck as well, which ended up being completely filthy by the time I got home anyway. No real point in washing cars in the winter unless your roads are salted, which ours are not. When I got home, I removed my AXP skid plate and then secured the bike to my Redline scissor lift stand, which has been such a useful tool to have in the shop for the last few years. The height adjustment alone is awesome, but it is particularly nice when you know a bike is going to be unrollable for an extended period of time and allows me to move the bike in and out of my workspace to make room for other projects. Removing the front forks is very straightforward and only takes a couple of minutes, but the shock is a little more involved. I believe you can slip these shocks out from the top if you tilt the subframe up, but in this case, the linkage and swing arm bearings definitely need a service. Honestly, I was not great about maintaining linkage bearings throughout the season and rode this bike in just about every condition you can imagine. Linkage bearings really should be serviced at least every 50 hours, so I was a little nervous to see what I would find. So I took the shock off the way the manual suggests by removing the entire swing arm axle. I did forget to break the chain beforehand, which created a bit of a Tetris situation, but I slipped the shock out and then removed the chain. I completely removed the linkage components, both from the swing arm and the frame. The link arm on the frame does require the rear brake pedal to come off. The linkage arm has one bearing that is too far gone for me to want to try and save, and the linkage knuckle has a bearing that is absolutely wrecked. Everything else is serviceable and should be good for another season once cleaned and greased up, which is what you aim for. Linkage and swing arm bearings should go just about forever if you keep up on maintenance. I ordered the parts I needed, which we'll go over in a minute, but let's shift gears to the suspension. For the forks, I just posted a disassembly of an identical set of forks, actually the original forks from this bike, in my latest KTM 200 build episode. That disassembly starts at 3 minutes and 20 seconds in that video and will be linked on screen and in the description. These forks are actually from a 2021 KTM 250 SXF, which has slightly different valving, but that is unimportant as the shim stacks went out to Daniel Schmidt at DSC Motorsports, who is revalving the suspension for me. As a rider who is still getting faster every season and trying to become more competitive, I'm getting to the point where I realize bone stock suspension probably isn't doing me any favors. I know it's mostly the rider, but suspension goes a long way, especially in a 3-hour cross-country race. I am really excited to ride this bike after the revalve and see how it feels. The KTM service manual is actually pretty thorough and easy to follow. At this point, I've done quite a few sets of forks and still only a couple shocks. Shocks still intimidate me a little bit, but following the manual and paying close attention to detail, I was able to get this shock disassembled pretty quickly without hassle, other than spilling oil all over the floor, which I somehow manage to do every time I work on suspension. With the shock fully apart, shim stacks went out to DSC Motorsports and new linkage bearings hadn't arrived yet, so it was time to tackle that valve adjustment. Comparing this bike to a couple other 350s recently, I think this motor is feeling noticeably underpowered. Don't get me wrong, it still rips, but it feels like it lacks the same explosiveness, and I found myself stalling the bike more recently, which could be rider error, but with my comfort level on this bike, I've stopped second guessing myself as I become more experienced, realizing that if I think I'm feeling something, I'm probably right. So my guess is these valves are out of spec, which is the most logical place to start given these symptoms. I did put a brand new OEM clutch pack in this bike over Christmas while I was riding down in Arizona, so the clutch has been removed from the equation as I thought I might be getting some clutch slip. I remember doing my first ever valve adjustment with my brother years ago and being so intimidated by what it entailed, but it's really only a handful of steps. I popped the valve cover off and removed the spark plug to begin. I know KTM makes a spark plug tool, and I even realized I had that tool after the fact, but for a long time now I've been using a 14mm deep socket and an extension. With the plug out, I removed the plug on the ignition cover, which left access to a 14mm bolt that I can spin to turn the motor over. I set the motor at top dead center on the compression stroke, which leaves the markings on the camshaft looking like this and aligns a notch in the crankshaft at the bottom of the bike. To lock the engine at top dead center, KTM's have this nice feature where you remove this thick copper washer and reinstall the bolt, causing it to sit in that notch and the motor to be locked. If this bolt would not go in, that would mean I am not in fact aligned at top dead center. With the engine locked at TDC, I checked valve clearance with a set of feeler gauges. I will put my measurements along with the correct clearances up on screen. Both of the exhaust valves were ever so slightly tight, which could explain why the bike still rips, but maybe not quite as hard as it should. Clearance on the intake side was within spec, so those do not need to be adjusted. I removed the cam bridge followed by the cam chain tensioner. The cap on the tensioner is easily stripped, so I was careful with this one. I then unthreaded the 24mm bolt holding that tensioner in, but needed to relieve tension before fully removing it as the clearance to the frame is tight. I removed both camshafts, being careful not to drop the cam chain into the case by securing it with a zip tie. This relieved that pressure on the tensioner, allowing the bolt and the tensioner to slide right out. Technically, I did not need to remove the intake camshaft since we're only adjusting exhaust valves, which I did not think about until I was editing this video. I was able to rotate the exhaust valve levers up to expose the shims. I carefully removed them with a magnet and then measured their thickness. A micrometer is the best tool for this, but mine was dead, so I used a set of calipers. The exhaust valve clearances were too tight, so the shim size needed to be decreased in order to increase the clearance. I selected the appropriate shims from my hot cam shim kit, installed those shims, and was ready to assemble. I slipped both camshafts back into place, being careful to ensure that timing is aligned as it should be. If I was a tooth off, I'd just slip the chain up and rotate the sprocket a tooth, repeating until I had it right. The cam bridge required being torqued in two different sequences, beginning with a lower torque value and then increasing. With that installed, we were ready for the tensioner once again, and these KTM tensioners are a bit funny. I actually reset this tensioner using the old shims, as KTM calls for an object between 2 and 2.5mm, and these fit the bill. When properly set, that distance should lock at 3mm, which I had, so I reinstalled the tensioner and its bolt. To then release the tensioner, it requires some force. I used a punch from Harbor Freight. KTM has a special tool for this that you do not need. You will know the tensioner released if the slack in the cam chain is gone. I now loosen up that crank lock bolt and rotate the engine a couple times to ensure my timing is correct before measuring valve clearance again. Thankfully, my math was correct and we are back in spec. It is a pain when you mess up and have to take all of this back apart, but it does happen. I buttoned the engine back up and decided to do a leak down test while I was here. My engine showed 2% leak down, which is a sign of a very healthy engine, so I reinstalled the spark plug as well as that crank bolt washer, which is a very important step to remember, and this motor should be good to go. And just in time, new linkage bearings and seals had arrived, so I transitioned my attention back to them. So I bought new bearings and seals for the link arm, a new lower bearing kit for the knuckle, and new seals for the other 4 bearings in the knuckle. For the arm, I began by trying to press the bearings through, which is how most of these work, but when I made no progress with heat and force from the vise, I realized these were probably lipped inside. Thankfully, I had this realization before doing any damage and traded the vise for a slide hammer and yanked these bearings out. I did confirm by doing so that this link arm does in fact have a lip where these bearings bottom out. I removed the blown up bearing from the knuckle, and one thing I found very interesting was the OEM seals from KTM are not the same as the ones on the bike. The ones that came on the bike seem to be an inferior design, and although I did neglect them, I think they were more likely to fail than the updated design. KTM did not denote in the parts diagram that these new seals supersede an old part, so it would appear that they quietly made this update. I gave the linkage components a nice 5-minute cleanup with Pryme MX wheels on the bench buffer, and then installed new bearings and seals on the link arm. For the 4 bearings in the knuckle not being replaced, I blasted them with parts cleaner, getting any dirt out of them before applying fresh grease. I was plenty happy with how they cleaned up, and these bearings should be good to go for a long time. Check out just how much gunk ended up in this bowl with the parts cleaner. Definitely a good thing I serviced those. I wrapped things up with the final bearings, seals, and spacers, and this linkage is fresh and ready to go. There are 2 more bearings that are often overlooked, and it's true they tend to need less maintenance because they do not see quite the same beating or exposure to dirt as the linkage, but I'm talking about the steering bearings. While the bike is this far apart, this is just another 20-minute task. I popped off the triple clamps to find a reasonable amount of dirt on the head tube, but really nothing had gotten into the bearing, which is what we like to see. I got everything cleaned up, added a bit of fresh grease to each bearing, and then buttoned it all back up. In order to tighten the 2 steering bolts, I did temporarily install an upper fork tube so that the triple clamps would be aligned and I could get this step out of the way for when the suspension is actually reassembled and ready to install. And speaking of suspension reassembly, my valving stacks arrived back from Daniel over at DSC Motorsports, and I was able to get my forks rebuilt. Similar to the teardown, I showed the detailed process of rebuilding these forks in the 3rd episode of my KTM 200 build series, so that will also be linked on screen and in the description if you'd like to see the process. With the forks rebuilt, I exchanged the WP stickers on the fork tubes for some DSC Motorsports decals and reinstalled the front end of the bike. Moving on to the shock, the assembly process is straightforward up until the point of bleeding the shock. The KTM service manual wants you to bleed the shock with a multi-$1,000 machine. Other videos on the internet suggest bleeding it as you install the seal head, but with that method, it can be very difficult to ensure it's bled properly. Daniel recommended I bleed the shock through the compression adjuster hole, which I do believe ended up being the best method. I used my Park Tool bike stand to hold the shock, which actually works very well, and I carefully cycled the shaft in and out to bleed air bubbles. Once I was close to done, I continually tilted the shock up and down, being sure to fill the space above the piston with oil and get those big air bubbles out. I will admit I was quite nervous of whether or not I had fully bled the shock, as this is where I have had a tendency to mess up when working on suspension over the years. I got the shock body buttoned up and brought it over to Mikey at Deja Moto, where he charged it with nitrogen for me. He said he could hear maybe a tiny bit of air left in the system, but nothing that he would be concerned to run, so I left feeling pleased that I had successfully rebuilt my shock. I got home and installed the spring, and this thing was ready to go back on the bike. So in the reverse process of disassembly, each of the linkage components were reinstalled and torqued to spec. The swing arm bearings were in good shape as I had mentioned, but I did clean them out and add some fresh grease while I had it all apart. Now at this point, there were still a few items I wanted to do before riding season, but a trip to Arizona that Monty and I had planned snuck up on me quickly, and I was out of time. All right, not quite the end of the maintenance video, but Monty and I are heading to Arizona in 2 days?
2 days.
2 days? So I had to get this thing back together. We'll finish the rest of the maintenance when we get back from this trip, but she's at least in better shape than she was. Fully rebuilt suspension, redone linkage. Let's see if it starts after that valve adjustment. Hear that rattle? That was from the cam chain tensioner not being fully tightened, and then once some oil pressure built up, it expanded and you heard that sound go away. So she should fire up more quickly now. Let's go ride! So we are back from Arizona. The trip unfortunately did not go exactly to plan. I think we're dealing with a small AC separation. That said, the bike did great. My front fender may have made it to the Glendale Supercross race. But for the bike, takeaways from the trip are the valve adjustment was effective and the bike is running strong, and the suspension upgrades were killer. This thing feels amazing. I did not get arm pump a single time, and I fatigued on the bike a whole lot less than normal. So let's jump into the remainder of the maintenance items for this bike, and then she's getting some cosmetic upgrades as well. Let's do it. As you can see, my chain and sprockets are pretty roached, and it is time for some new ones. I bought this bike with 4 hours on it and didn't realize the gearing was changed from stock. I've been running a 1349, whereas stock is 1451. First gear was too low on this thing, so I'm moving back to stock gearing, which I think I will like. I'm now running Dirt Trick Sprockets, which are the best sprockets on the market. They are insanely durable, made in the USA, backed by an incredible warranty, and will outlast any other sprocket on the market. They also offer custom laser etching, so I've got the nice added touch of KP on the rear sprocket, and these should be the last sprockets I ever put on this bike. For the front sprocket, I intentionally left the case saver off to remind myself to torque that bolt once the rear wheel and chain were installed. A couple quick tips for changing rear sprockets if you've never done it. Use heat on the nuts before trying to break them, as most sprocket bolts come with red thread locker and won't budge without the aid of heat. Once you've cracked them a quarter turn or so, then you can hold the nut and remove the bolts with an impact or your tool of choice. For installation, I use some red stuck nuts thread locker, as loose sprocket bolts is never a fun situation. The manual does suggest a torque value, and a crow's foot wrench will fit on some of those nuts, but the spokes are in the way for most of them, so I usually give it a good uggy-duggy and call it a day. Now the bike was ready for some fresh tires, so I pulled my tires off using my Rabbit Honda and grabbed a fresh Shinko 525 for the rear, which is a tire I've been very impressed with. My friend recommended using Murphy's tire mounting compound as it's way cheaper than any of the Moose lubes, but I got a comment on my last KTM 200 video saying I should not be using Murphy's. I did some research, and Moose gels are silicone based while Murphy's is water based, so it may break down more quickly or make the Moose run hotter, but I didn't find any real world examples of people who have compared the differences, so I'm going to do exactly that and see if the life of my Moose is impacted by running Murphy's. I installed a Shinko 216 MX front tire, and I ran the 546 for most of last season, so I'm going to see how I like this tire in comparison. And before I allowed myself to forget, I torqued the front sprocket. I found it easiest to do it sitting on the bike with my foot on the rear brake pedal. The header needed to be cleaned up as dirt gets baked onto it due to heat, but Scotch-Brite makes that a quick and easy job. Finally, the bike got a new air filter from No Toil, and it was time for some cosmetic changes. So I need to give a big thank you to mxplastics.com for the fresh white kit for this bike. Gosh, I love the look of a naked bike, but we all know this thing wouldn't be complete without a fresh graphics kit from DeCal Works. The guys over at DeCal Works absolutely killed it on this kit. I'm so thrilled on how it turned out. I know I say that for every single bike that I use their graphics for, but that's the truth. It's always so exciting getting these installed. And there truly is just something about fresh plastics and graphics that makes me feel ready for riding season, ready to race, and even more confident. Now to really tie this new look together, I think a new seat cover is in order. Is this really my dirt bike? I am in awe at how sexy this thing is looking. We've got just a couple more things to do before we wrap up this video, and this bike is ready for the season, so let's finish them up. So I have definitely beat this FMF pipe up, but a new graphic actually went a long way for how it looks. DeCal Works offers custom exhaust graphics, and I'm really happy with how it looks, and they send 2 when you order these, which is really nice, as I have debated Cerakoting this pipe, which gives me the opportunity to do so without having to order another graphic. Finally, the side panel tabs on this generation KTM that slot into the rear fender tend to break. If you get too far back seat, or even if you scrape your fender doing pivot turns, I've had these break, so I now install an additional nut and bolt connecting those pieces for added strength. It is super low profile and isn't even noticeable if you don't know it's there. Well, she doesn't look like a 100-hour bike. I have to say, looking at this bike all freshened up and my history and memories on it, I am thrilled to put another season on this thing as opposed to having sold it and buying a new bike. Obviously, it required some time and effort to get this thing back to race-ready condition, but a big part of riding dirt bikes is maintaining them. Like I said, I feel like I've got some unfinished business on this thing, so I'm really excited for the 2024 season. I truly can't thank all of the companies that support these projects enough. If you're in need of suspension service, sprockets, tires, plastics, graphics, anything I went over in this video, links to companies I work with are all in the description below. As I've said in videos before, the companies I choose to work with are companies I truly believe in. I've had nothing but great experiences with all of them, and I'm sure you will too. If you enjoyed this video or learned something from it, please consider subscribing to the channel. We are getting awful close to 100,000 subscribers, and when I reach that number, I will be selecting one of you guys to come out here and ride this spring. One more enormous thank you for all of the continued support, and as always, more great stuff coming soon.